Hey, what's up? My name is Marcus Ray Bettis. My pronouns are he, him, his. I originally come from the land of Texas. My family also comes from Texas and Mexico. Part of us were from Mexico and crossed the river, like my grandpa when he was 14 years old. And part of us were always from here. So we never crossed the border crossed us. Thank you, Eva Longoria, for that lovely line. I am recognized as a Tejano, as a Latino. I am not Chicano. I am not Spanish. I am not ethnically ambiguous. I speak Spanish a little bit. This is what looking bilingüe means to me.
You said you identify as Tejano and Latino. Go a little bit further into what those mean more specifically when you use one versus the other.
I think Latino is just the title that I use more frequently in the spaces that I exist in, especially in the theater world, in film and television, just because the nuance of what it means to be Tejano isn't quite understood by audiences yet or by people in power yet. So I wear Latino because when I know I'm entering a room, I am entering the room for all Latinos who haven't been able to enter rooms yet. And I get to wear the shield of Tejano when I'm in rooms that is more specific because that is something that is missing from the world. I want to create art and see art that is about being Tejano because it is so different than being raised as a Latino anywhere else in the United States, as it is for any ethnicity. Tejano means that we are of Mexican American descent, and this land that we're on has always been our land. And you can go down the street and it's in the Texas historical markers that I pass every time that I'm coming to my mom's house from Houston. This is our story. The Battle of the Alamo, like I pass the Alamo all the time because I go to San Antonio a lot. So that is something that isn't really seen a lot of on television and theater. I think the specificity and the nuance of the Tejano culture, how ranching plays such a huge part in our culture, how hunting plays a huge part in our culture. That's not something that's always spoken about when it comes to Mexican Americans in other parts of the country.
That's a really interesting point. I didn't know about the hunting. Can you tell me more about that?
My entire family has always been hunters. My great-grandfather and my grandfather would take my father hunting. Because they had to deal with racism, they were typically arrested for poaching in areas of Texas where other white men were allowed to hunt. So what they would do, so they would be arrested by like the Texas Rangers or the county sheriffs. But the people working at the jail were Latinos too. They were Tejanos, they were in the small town. And so what one of them would do when one of them was arrested, like say my father was in jail for poaching, the other two would go kill a deer and then leave it on the doorsteps of the jail. So then that the jailers would cook the deer so everyone could have a good meal while they were behind bars.
Wow.
Yeah, hunting is such obviously very controversial, especially when it comes to the argument of guns. But my father just always taught us we never kill what we don't use. Trophy hunting, not a thing in our house. It was about like that deer would then provide that we could use in tamales for the entire winter season. All these small nuances that are integral to what is my culture and where I come from.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's super interesting. I had no idea. And I will say you've got some amazing family stories. There's no way that I can even capture, a good percentage of them, but just the ones I've heard, I'm like, I can listen to these all day. They're just so fascinating. And like you said, they really do give nuance to what it is to be Tejano. And that's so amazing. So thank you for sharing that. You said that being Mexican American is breaking generational curses. Can you elaborate more on that?
Specifically, who it is today to be Mexican American, we are working to reverse the identity that our grandparents and our parents tried so hard to hide. My generation is different because we are reclaiming everything that comes from where we come from and that is ours and that is in our blood and in our land. Colorism is definitely a thing in Mexican American families, and part of that is because the whiter your skin is, the easier you are to be able to move through American society without having to wonder like, wait, what are you? Like I remember just being in grad school and I would give tours of the university and people would be like, so like where are you from? Like what are you? And then I would tell them and they'd be like, oh, like I couldn't tell, like it was a little up in the air, like ethnically ambiguous. And I'm like, That is something that I carry with me. I understand, but I also like have to be aware of how I am changing the narrative for all Latinos, Mexican Americans that do look like me or that don't look like me.
Yeah.
That look like my father, that look like my grandfather, who have more melanated skin. So we're breaking those ideas, what we're supposed to be as Latinos. And I think that's the story of many creatives, Mexican Americans that are trying to take over and help tell our stories better.
What did Spanish mean to you growing up?
Just being younger, I remember that speaking Spanish was just something that I experienced all the time. We went to my grandparents every Friday, and my grandparents only spoke Spanish with my mom and her siblings. So I just heard it, and it was just a part of life. I come from a community where 90% of the community is Latino. So, like our gas stations serve breakfast tacos, which is not a thing in most other places in the world, like it's just easy. Like, oh yeah, you want breakfast, you can stop at the gas station and get a breakfast taco. Like that is just a known and accepted fact.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So it's just a part of who we are. And I think like the first time I realized like speaking Spanish was something different was when I was at a national speech and debate tournament my sophomore year of high school, and I was doing an event called Student Congress. And the event is like Congress. You debate bills and try to pass them. The bill was on making English the official language of the United States. And I negated it and gave a speech. And I spoke in a little bit of Spanish. One of the students stood up and was like, but don't you feel like your grandparents' life and your life would be different if you just spoke English and you didn't have to speak Spanish? And that's when I realized, like, oh, there is a world out there that feels like my Spanish is a threat. It's like, speaking of generational curses, like I am just so different from the rest of my family. Whereas like I talked about ranching, like that's what my cousins do, that's what my uncles do, or military, like the warriors, that's what the machismo is, like that's what men are supposed to be. And I remember my graduation speech, because I was salutatorian, I put Spanish in the speech. I did it because I wanted my grandparents to hear me speak it in front of our entire town that was at our graduation. And they didn't show up to my graduation. And that hurt me because like that was my few links that I had to who they are. So Spanish to me was like this link to the past that I can bring to the present. And to be Mexican American and creative, yeah, it's that thread, but it's hard to just have that singular thread. And that's sometimes what it felt like growing up.
And that story, and I guess this is what this entire project is about, looking bilingual, like kind of straddling these two worlds, really having an olive branch towards each section, because that is what you are made of. It's such a beautiful way to include your family, to honor your maternal language, one of your maternal languages, and so devastating to feel that there's resistance there. You talk so brilliantly about being an actor and a professional who wears, many hats within the arts. Really, your entire story is what really brought you to this. And despite the fact that your family have other professions that is expected.
Yes, expected, because it's not like a choice. It's just,
right.
These are the only things that I can do to make my family proud in their eyes.
And so you've got all these layers. How would you advise a student who potentially has grown up in similar shoes to yours to move forward and serve their community today?
I mean, God, I hope that there are others like me that come from where I come from that have the courage to not need acceptance from our community right now. I don't have an extended family that's very not understanding, but they just don't understand. Like, it's not that they're not understanding, it's just they don't get what I do. And as a creative, they don't get it and they don't try. So I know that there are other young Latinos out there doing or want to do what I want to do.
Well, doing what you are doing.
Yeah, doing what I'm doing. Yes, I am doing it, I guess. Yeah, I'm living it. I'm living the dream.
You're doing it. You're working on it. It's a work.
Yeah.
It's a work in progress, but you've been doing it.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I am. I just filmed something, and I'm like, wow, like I am here on a set like being computer generated into a video game kids are going to play for generations because it is a big game. And I'm like, whoa, like this is amazing. Like this is whoa, like what am I doing?
That's so cool. I'm like nerding out right now.
There's a book called The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. And in it, he talks about like the parallelism of life, the thing that I've lived by, because I've had a lot of tragedy that I've lived through. I've had a lot of adversity coming from where I come from and being who I am and everything that I am, is that in order to feel the rivers of joy, you must first dig the riverbeds of sorrow. So all of these young Latinos that are like me, that come from where I come from, I want them to understand that this adversity that they go through, that's why it's so important they keep going. Because these stories are not told enough. They're not seen enough. They're not created enough. Who they are is not seen enough. And the nuances of who we are, everything that we are, every single fiber, that should be on stage doing Shakespeare. That should be on stage doing Arthur Miller. That it's their words, but for us to say them brings a whole new level to who we are and to what the world sees we are.
The generation now that's really making this change and really speaking up is supporting that. And I think that we, you have contacts, friends, that are supportive of that way of thinking and of those voices. I know that I do. And when I feel like I don't, I know where to find them or who to ask or where to go. And I think that will just help us cultivate further into the future. Now, going into what you were just saying, you talked to me about mainstream Latinidad versus Tejano Latinidad and how you're working to change that narrative. You started off a little bit there, but can you tell me more specifically how else you're working to change that narrative?
I think when I first entered the industry, I was someone who just was like, well, I need to be Latino enough so that I could go out for the gangster, or Latino enough so I can go out for the Dominican shop owner. Like, I just want to be a blank slate of Latino for these white casting directors. The universality that exists in the specificity of ourselves. Like, if I am specific to my story, where I'm come from and what I'm creating, then the other, going back to what we just talked about, then the youth of today that are Mexican American in Texas are like, oh wait, my story is interesting enough that the world will want to watch it. I spent the last year learning screenwriting, and I was just accepted into a episodic lab to work on my pilot, which is about a family of cousins set in San Antonio, and it's so specific to our culture, just like everything that comes with it, what it means to be from Texas and Mexican American and just be second generation. Because I'm so tired of the story that it's like where, oh, if it's a Mexican American story, then it's going to be about one of their parents being an immigrant, or it's going to be about them being an immigrant, or it's going to be something about the border and it's dangerous. There should be no blanket idea of what it means to be Latino. Yeah. Like, we are so specific. So it's okay if we don't connect with something else in the mainstream media, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't go create our own thing too.
And for me, it's like, but why would we shoot each other down? Because while we're not a monolith, we do have parallel experiences or things that we can understand, or we can find similarities, even you and I, that we can appreciate and laugh, but things that we can learn and be like, oh, I get that. Not exactly, but from this perspective, or this is my story. And for me, there's unification in that too. And you and I talked about Selena, for example, Selena, the movie, and I was not, a Tejana little girl, but how excited was I? First of all, she existed, but it was also impactful, her death. And guess what? I knew very well that I was not exactly what she was, but I saw that connection. And so I wasn't mad that it wasn't the story of a Puerto Rican singer or a Cuban singer, or a Caribbean singer in general. For me, it's like, wow, well, look at this and look at the parallels and how interesting that is, but look at the differences and how interesting that is. And I think that there's celebration in that as well.
Yeah, I think, like Selena is that's the first film where I recognize myself on television or like we talked about, a television film, that is the first place I recognize. Her father was the first father that I saw on TV that I was like, oh yeah, that's my dad. That is just my family. But that's exactly it. It was so specific to our culture, but it's still connected with you. Miles and miles away in New York, like the New York City area, like it's just, like we have to be willing to accept that like we can have all our own voices and not criticize each other for whatever those voices are.